All right, y'all ready? First of all, thank you all for coming. Today in this body and behind us in this chambers, we'll be voting on the National Defense Authorization Act, known as the NDAA. For 58 years inside this chamber, it's been a bipartisan vote. It's been a vote because the bill has always focused on the troops first, that we kept politics out of it. In those 58 years, Democrats have been in the majority and Republicans have been in the majority. Today is a very shameful day. Today is the day that they break 58 years of putting troops first. In a few moments, they'll take a vote where they put politics before the defense of this country. Inside this bill, they cut funding for the personnel. Hypersonics is a place that we're very concerned about, where Russia and China are today. They cut it. They make America less safe. For Gitmo, they now want to take the terrorists and bring them to the homeland. For those members who vote for the NDAA, I want them to look their constituents in the eye. When the most dangerous terrorists in this country or in this world get moved to the homeland of America, we will not be as safe as we are today. But the most egregious part of what we see is not that way in the Senate. In the Senate, the NDAA kept with the tradition. They put troops first. It was 86 members of the Senate voted for it. The leader on the Republican side and Chuck Schumer both voted for it. What we have learned is this is no longer the Democratic Party inside the House. It has become the new Socialist Democratic Party. And that's a disgrace, because troops should always come first before politics. Now I'd like to introduce our whip, Steve Scalise.
Thank you, Kevin. First, I'd like to ask you to keep the people of South Louisiana in your prayers as Tropical Storm Barry approaches land in the next 24 hours. I spoke with President Trump yesterday, and the federal government's making all the preparations that need to be made, including the emergency declaration the president issued, to make sure that our local officials have all the tools they need to keep people safe. And safety is the first and top priority. Obviously, we're watching things like the Mississippi River height, but we're also making sure that people listen to their local officials. And if your local official said it's time to evacuate, then be ready to get out. Main focus ought to be on protecting lives, protecting families, and making sure that the government's response is ready wherever it's needed. So I appreciate those prayers, and we'll continue to keep a close eye on everything in the next 24 hours. Now, talking about our nation's defense, it's really a sad day, as our leader talked about. We've all seen the internal problems within the Democrat conference, but just to appease the far left socialist radical element, Speaker Pelosi is putting our troops at risk by drafting a bill that breaks with that 58-year tradition, moving a bipartisan NDAA bill that puts our troops first. That should always be the priority. We saw a few years ago, when our nation's defense was being neglected, we were losing men and women in uniform to training deaths by a 5-to-1 margin over combat deaths. Think about that. Because our men and women in uniform, not talking about battles in theater, but when they were here in America training to protect our country, they were more at risk than they went into combat by a 5-to-1 margin. And we finally started to reverse that. And in this bill, they actually undermine those efforts by taking away some of the spare parts funding that was so necessary in stopping planes from falling out of the sky because they didn't have the basic spare parts. That's how dangerous this bill is, that undermines our nation's defense. Speaker Pelosi needs to heed what the Senate already did. The Senate, Republicans and Democrats came together to put our troops first, passing a bill with 86 votes that makes sure our men and women in uniform have the tools they need to keep America safe as they train in a safe way. Right now, you look at this NDAA bill on the floor today, and it goes in the opposite direction. It goes in a very dangerous direction, not only for our national defense, but undermining the safety and security of our men and women in uniform as they train to protect our country. I urge Speaker Pelosi to reject the radical socialist approach to governing and work with Republicans to get things done that help the American people. With that, I'd like to introduce our conference chair, Liz Cheney.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you very much, Steve. Congress has no more important responsibility than to provide for the defense of the nation. It's the single most important thing that we do here. If we don't get that right, nothing else that we do here matters. For 58 years, we've seen this process of our National Defense Authorization Act be handled in a way that has been bipartisan. This is the first time that we've seen in all of that time a partisan approach. And not only are we facing a situation today where Speaker Pelosi and the Democrats have decided to play politics with this crucial issue, we're facing a situation where the changes that they're making, the items that they're insisting on, the things that they're refusing to fund, all of those actions are helping America's adversaries. And I don't say that lightly. Helping America's adversaries, because in a day and age in which we're facing significant threats from the Russians, from the Chinese, from the Iranians, we have adversaries who are in fact developing and deploying weapon systems that the Democrats are refusing to provide America with the resources to develop and deploy. It is absolutely inexcusable, it's absolutely shameful, and we ought to be in a position where we can come together to do the right thing. But to sit here in this body and watch Speaker Pelosi and the Democratic leadership feel as though even before they got to the floor and started to have to placate the far left wing of their party, they were providing cuts to the president's top-line request, cuts to our missile defense, cuts to our modernization of our nuclear forces, refusing to allow us to deploy low-yield nuclear weapons. It's shameful. They're failing fundamentally to uphold their constitutional duty, and they're failing in the most important thing we do, which is be worthy of the sacrifice of those men and women who put on the uniform and go to protect all of us. When Congress politicizes the National Defense Authorization Act, we are not worthy of the men and women who are defending us on the front lines today. So we call on Speaker Pelosi to end this partisan game and do what's right and to fulfill her constitutional obligation to provide for the common defense. And with that, I'd like to call on the Republican leader of the Strategic Forces Subcommittee, whose subcommittee has been the one that has faced some of the most significant cuts and failures with respect to what the Democrats are doing with this NDAA, Mr. Mike Turner.
Thank you, Liz. I appreciate your fight on the Armed Services Committee to try to make this a bipartisan bill. Unfortunately, this partisan bill that we're going to vote on the floor of the House today was a partisan bill from the moment that it hit the committee. From every aspect of the provisions, this is a bill that makes us less safe. The focus of the Republicans have been on supporting our men and women in uniform and making our nation strong. We're for a strong defense to keep our nation safe. Unfortunately, this bill contains a number of provisions that break the bipartisan sentiment, that spirit that we have had, and they're provisions that hopefully will never become law. I'm the chair of Strategic Forces, which includes nuclear weapons. This bill includes two provisions that I'm certain confuse our allies and our adversaries. In Russia today, they're probably very curious as to why the House of Representatives would be voting to, by statute, bind the United States to the INF treaty that Russia has violated and stepped out of. I'm certainly they're very curious as to why the House of Representatives would vote today to pull a nuclear weapon that's on its way for deployment to our submarines for the purposes of deterring Russian aggression. This is a bill that makes us less safe. It certainly weakens our ability to protect our adversaries, our allies. It certainly, I think, emboldens our adversaries. It breaks the bipartisan spirit that we've had, and I think this bill will, in the Senate, hopefully change so it goes back to our focus of protecting our men and women in uniform and strengthening our national security.
And now we'd like to turn things over to the Republican leader of the Armed Services Committee, Mr. Mac Thornberry.
Thanks, Liz. I'll just say briefly, I'm proud about the work that we have done through the Armed Services Committee on a bipartisan basis over the last several years. When defense budgets were cut by 20%, it had real life and death consequences. We saw aviation accidents, other kinds of accidents going up at an alarming rate. And together we started to turn that around. What concerned us this year about the bill coming out of committee is that we would backslide, that we would not continue to go forward and make progress, but we would go backwards with readiness, being less capable of keeping up with our adversaries and what they were doing. So that was our concern coming out of the committee. But once it has gone to the floor, the bill has taken a radical left turn. And as y'all know, there is a strain of thought in American politics when it comes to national security that says we're the problem. And the way to make the world better is to make America weaker. And unfortunately, we're seeing some of that come through in the bill today. And it's not about us. It's not about some academic exercise. It's about real life men and women who are putting their lives on the line for us. That's who we have the primary obligation to, as well as to the American people, to help keep them safe. So there's good and bad in this bill, no question. A lot of these members have contributed provisions to it, but if you look at the direction that is taken in the big picture, it is moving in a direction that does make America less safe. And I do not believe that that any sort of bill like that should or will get to the president or stand a chance of being enacted. We can do better, and hopefully at some point we will. I think now the Deputy Whip, Mr. Ferguson.
Thank you. As I stand here today, I want to look out, I want to speak to every parent that has a child that's been willing to serve in the military. I have a daughter and a son-in-law that are serving in the United States Navy. Two very incredibly bright, strong young people that are capable of doing anything that they want to in this great country, and they chose to serve this nation by defending its freedom. And they go into that job every day knowing that their lives are at risk. They know that they are willing to put their lives on the line for our freedom. But here's what they expect. They expect those risks to come from foreign adversaries and those wishing to do their fellow Americans harm. They never ever imagined that the threat would come from this building that is behind me. It is unconscionable that Nancy Pelosi and the socialists are willing to put their political agenda ahead of the safety and well-being of the young men and women of this country willing to defend our freedom. And I just have a question I'd like Pelosi to answer. If something ever happened to my daughter or to my son-in-law, would she be willing to come to the funeral of one of these young service members, stand before the family and explain to that family why her partisan politics were more important than their lives? It's shameful. I call on her to change course, take this bill down, and do what is right for this country and the men and women that are serving. With that, I will call on one of the gentlemen that has served this great nation, both in Congress and in the military, my colleague, Michael Waltz.
Thank you, Rep. Ferguson. I'm a Green Beret by background, 23 years in the Army and counting, still serving in the National Guard. And one of the main reasons I ran, I'm a freshman, was to bring that on-the-ground perspective to what we're doing here, but to constantly remind my colleagues that we are a nation at war. Whether that's a Cold War with Russia and China, or whether that's a hot war with Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And we cannot wish these wars away, which I think unfortunately, many of my colleagues are trying to do through this bill. We cannot stick our head in the sand. We cannot cut the operations and maintenance budget of the Overseas Contingency Operations Fund by $17 billion while men and women are still in harm's way. We have special operators as we speak, as we're standing here, as we're all about to leave this weekend, in 70 countries as we speak. We have more soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marine deployed overseas than the British, Canadian, and Australian armies combined, ensuring freedom around the world. We can't walk backwards, as Chairman Thornberry has said. I think the Senate bill took a large step forward in a bipartisan way, 86-8, which you rarely see coming out of Washington, D.C. anymore. And this bill, unfortunately, just falls short. It's not worthy of the names on memorial walls all over our country, and it's not worthy of those soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marine down range. And we can do better, and we should do better. And I hope before we have to take this vote that Speaker Pelosi gets us to a better place. And I think I now will have Representative Babbitt, or
Yes, sir. Thank
Go
you,
Navy.
Michael. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you, Michael. I appreciate that. I'm proud to be up here with my colleagues in the Republican Party who've tried to do the right thing by our servicemen. Congress has long observed a 58-year tradition and honored duty of putting aside partisan rhetoric to ensure the safety of Americans, and doing so through the development of a bipartisan National Defense Authorization Act. That is until now. As a son of a World War II Army vet, the father of a decorated Navy SEAL, and a veteran myself, having served in the Army and the Air Force, I want to see how House Democrats have conducted this process that we see today. It brings me great concern for the security of our nation. Instead of working across the aisle to ensure that our armed forces are appropriately equipped to address the emerging threats from our adversaries, the majority is more interested in using this NDAA to push extreme partisan provisions at the expense of our military readiness. The unfortunate reality is that Democrat leadership has allowed their party to rob this bill of any chance that it had of becoming law by kowtowing to their extreme socialist left wing. And this has resulted in every single American, regardless of their party, to be put at an unnecessary risk. It is painfully evident that while House Democrats may be unwilling to compromise with us, they are certainly willing to compromise the security of this nation for political gain. We, the Republicans, are not. Thank you very much. I'd like to call on a representative from Florida, Neil Dunn. Dr. Dunn?
Thank you very much, Brian. I'd like to echo the comments that have been made by my colleagues. Today is a sad day for this Congress, a new low in partisan politics. Speaker Pelosi has proposed to bring a bill to the floor that will injure and endanger our men and women in uniform. If we pass this bill, we are abdicating our responsibility to everybody who's ever worn the uniform of this nation. And let me just say, if we pass this bill, I will be deeply ashamed of this House. Now you'll bet.
Thank you all very much for being here today, and thank you very much for my colleagues, many of whom are veterans and parents or parents of men and women who are serving today. And I think you can see the commitment that we have to being worthy, doing our job to help support and defend our men and women in uniform, and really very deeply concerned about the direction things are going in. So thank you very much.